The phone call should never have happened. Not from him. Not from a former man of the National Security Agency. Not from someone who had once worked inside one of the most secretive intelligence systems on Earth. And yet in Washington, after the job was already behind him, after the badge and the clearance were gone, Ronald William Pelton did something that made this case different from so many others. He did not wait to be approached. He did not need a handler to study his weaknesses. He did not need flattery ideology or a slow seduction into betrayal. He went looking for the Soviets himself. That is what makes this story so unsettling. It was not a trap carefully laid by Moscow over many years. It was not the classic image of a spy being lured across the line step by step. This was colder than that, simpler, more disturbing. A man who once understood part of America's hidden listening machine decided on his own to walk toward the enemy and offer what he knew for cash. And what he knew was not trivial. He was not selling gossip. He was not passing along rumors from some forgotten office. The secrets tied to Ronald Pelton touched one of the most sensitive contests of the Cold War, the invisible war of signals, intercepts, and silence. The war where the greatest advantage was not firepower, but knowledge. Who was listening, how they were listening, and whether the other side had any idea. If those secrets were exposed, entire operations could die in the dark. Years later, investigators and declassified records would paint the outline of the damage. The FBI would describe a former communications specialist who volunteered himself to the Soviet embassy and then spent years giving up classified information. NSA's own internal history would remember the case with a bitter title, A Spy Like Us. But before the arrests, before the trial, before the life sentences, there was just one terrifying fact. A man, trusted with American secrets, decided that betrayal was something he could initiate with a phone call. And the question was no longer whether he crossed the line. It was how much of the nation's most valuable intelligence went with him when he did. Before Ronald Pelton became a spy, he looked like the kind of man the system was built to trust. He had served in the U.S. Air Force, where he studied Russian at the height of the Cold War, when language itself could be a weapon. In that era, to understand Russian was not just an academic skill. It meant access. It meant utility. It meant you could be placed near the most sensitive edge of the intelligence contest between Washington and Moscow. In 1965, Pelton joined the National Security Agency. That matters because NSA was not simply another government office. It was the quiet center of America's signals intelligence empire, the place where fragments of voice data code and transmission were turned into strategic advantage. The agency lived in shadows by design. Its greatest successes were often the ones the public would never know. And inside that world, Pelton was not some wandering outsider who brushed against secrets by accident. He worked in areas connected to Soviet targets, communications intelligence, and the machinery of collection itself. He moved through a professional environment built around intercepts, classified methods, and the constant effort to understand what the Soviet Union was saying without letting the Soviets know America was listening. Even if he was not the architect of those operations, he was close enough to understand something priceless, how the system functioned. That is what made him dangerous. A spy can steal documents. A traitor with context can do far worse. He can explain what the documents mean. He can tell an adversary which programs matter, which channels are vulnerable, which losses would hurt, and which American capabilities must be shut down first. On the surface, Pelton was not famous. He was not glamorous. He did not look like the kind of man who would one day rank among the most damaging espionage cases in NSA history. But that is exactly why the warning signs were so easy to miss. The real threat was not outside the walls. It was a man inside the system who had learned enough to understand where a single betrayal could cut deepest. The break did not come with ideology. It did not come with some grand conversion or a secret sympathy for Moscow or a dramatic crisis of conscience. Ronald Pelton's descent was smaller than that, meaner than that. It came in the form of money problems that kept tightening around his life until they became impossible to ignore. And that may be the most disturbing part of all, because history often teaches people to look for traitors in the form of fanatics, true believers, or men driven by ego so large it swallows everything else. Pelton was something more ordinary, more dangerous in a quieter way, a man whose life was starting to come apart and who knew exactly what kind of information could be turned into cash. According to later accounts, Pelton's financial situation had been deteriorating badly. He had tried to build an expensive home. The burden became too heavy. By April 1979, he filed for bankruptcy. 2 months later, he was out of the NSA. That sequence matters. He lost the job, but not the knowledge. The clearance disappeared, but the secrets stayed with him. The government door closed, yet inside his head remained years of understanding about how America listened to one of its greatest enemies. And outside that door, life was not stabilizing. It was slipping. Pelton drifted through unstable work and uncertain income. The Cold War did not care about his bills. His creditors did not care about his former service. Whatever discipline or identity had once come with working inside the intelligence world was gone, replaced by the grinding reality of a man who had fallen hard and could see no clean way back up. That is where the case begins to darken, because desperation alone does not create a spy. Plenty of people go broke. Plenty of lives collapse without crossing into treason. What turns crisis into betrayal is the moment a person stops seeing secrets as protected knowledge and starts seeing them as inventory. Somewhere in that descent, Pelton crossed that mental line. The Soviet Union was no longer the adversary he had once worked against from inside the American system. It became, in his mind, a market. And once that happened, the next step was no longer unthinkable. It was practical. On January 14, 1980, Ronald Pelton made the decision that turned private collapse into active espionage. It began with a phone call, not a coded exchange arranged by some seasoned Soviet recruiter, not a long-running covert relationship finally reaching its payoff. Just a former NSA man reaching out to the Soviet embassy in Washington by his own choice, as if betrayal had become one more problem to solve, with a calm voice and a telephone. That is the moment this story hardens, because once that call was made, everything changed. The line between grievance and treason was gone. Pelton was no longer a man under financial strain, no longer just a disgruntled former insider, carrying dangerous knowledge in his head. He was now initiating contact with the enemy, deliberately, methodically, and according to later records, he met the Soviets the very next day. Imagine the tension in that meeting. A former American intelligence specialist sitting across from officers of the rival superpower he had once helped monitor. No dramatic speech, no ideological manifesto, no illusion about what was happening. The Soviets were not meeting a defector in the romantic Cold War sense. They were meeting a seller, and Pelton was not offering theory. He was offering access to the inner logic of American signals intelligence. That is what made the moment so dangerous. Documents can be stolen, names can be passed. But a man like Pelton could do something worse. He could explain where the real pressure points were. He could tell the other side which operations mattered most, which collection efforts were vulnerable, and how America's hidden ear was positioned against the Soviet Union. The first meeting was not the end of the betrayal. It was the opening transaction, because once the Soviets understood what Pelton knew, this was no longer about one desperate man and one reckless decision. It had become an intelligence disaster in motion, one that would unfold over years in secret, while the United States had no idea how much of its advantage was already being sold away. For 5 years, Ronald Pelton sold pieces of one of America's most sensitive advantages to the Soviet Union. That fact alone is devastating. But the real damage was not measured by the number of meetings, or even by the classified pages behind them. It was measured by what happened when an adversary learned how the United States was listening. Because that was the heart of Pelton's betrayal. He did not hand over some isolated secret with narrow value. He provided details tied to U.S. signals, intelligence programs aimed at the Soviets themselves. In the Cold War, that kind of knowledge was strategic gold. If Moscow understood the methods being used against it, the implications reached far beyond embarrassment. Communications could be altered. Channels could go silent. Vulnerabilities could be sealed. Entire streams of intelligence could dry up almost overnight. That is why cases like this are so dangerous. Not because they create one visible explosion, but because they quietly blind a nation in places where it had once been able to see. And the price makes it worse. Years of betrayal, years of damage, years of exposure, all for an amount of money that looked painfully small beside the cost. Pelton did not bring down a system for a fortune worthy of legend. He traded away extraordinary secrets for a sum that only sharpened the tragedy. What he sold was worth far more to the Soviet Union than it ever was to him. When the truth finally surfaced, the ending was brutal. Investigation led to confession. Confession led to trial. Trial led to conviction. Pelton was sentenced to multiple life terms, plus additional years of punishment that reflected more than personal guilt. It reflected the scale of what had been endangered. And that is the final weight of this story. Some espionage cases begin with ideology. Some begin with blackmail. Some begin with careful recruitment by a hostile service. This one began with debt collapse and one man deciding to make the first move. No glamorous double life, no mythic super spy. Just a former insider who knew exactly where America was vulnerable, picked up a phone and sold that knowledge to the enemy. Sometimes, the most dangerous betrayal in history does not begin with hatred. It begins with need. And once that line is crossed, the damage can outlive the man who caused it.